Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to History Hack. With me today, I have a special guest. As you can tell, I'm a little bit on the somber side because my guest today is Malka Levine. She is a Holocaust survivor, and she has written a book called A Mother's Courage: How I Survived the Holocaust, a remarkable story of bravery, kindness, and hope. Malka, I think we should just begin straight away with the questions. Can you tell us a little bit about your family, where you grew up, just a little bit of background about yourself?
Well, I grew up in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, Northwest Ukraine, which was a border town, which was very influenced by Poland, because at that time it was so close to Poland, and we were also occupied by the Poles, actually, up to 1939. We were, until the Russians came in. And my father had a shop, a bicycle shop, and he had also built a factory. He was he was very good when it came to engineering, and we had sort of a middle class home. My mother, in actual fact, came from a village just outside the town, a village called Litovich. My grandfather was a dealer in wheat, and my mother also became, once she married, she also went into partnership with him. And we were just a Jewish middle-class family. My brothers went to private school. I was too small. In actual fact, I was born 1939, just when war broke out. Yeah.
The question, how old were your brothers when the war broke out? Because you said there was you
in
and your two brothers.
1939, my brother would be, the older one would be 7, and the younger one 5 in 1930.
So our listeners know, obviously, that the Germans invade Poland on the 1st of September, and then obviously the 17th. The Soviets then invade 17 days later, but you don't end up at the beginning under German occupation. You end up under Soviet occupation.
Yeah, well, Eastern Europe was partitioned when Hitler and Molotov had the infamous agreement that they wouldn't attack each other once they declared war on any country. So in 1939, the Russians came in. For us, in fact, you laugh, it was really a liberation to get rid of the Poles, because the Poles weren't very egalitarian, as you well know. And things have changed. The Poles have left, and some of the Jewish people could take sort of positions in government offices and such. And it was a feeling of independent in a way. And then in 1941, when Hitler declared Barbarossa, and in June the Germans came in. Yeah.
Before we get to that, before we get to that subject, can you tell me a bit about what happened to your family when the Soviets came in? Did your father manage to keep his shop?
No. When the Russians came in, it was only in the beginning. They didn't have enough time to make any changes. And I think Ludmir or Vladimir Wolinsk, or Włodzimierz Wolinsk in Polish, Włodzimierz, it was small fry for them. So there weren't a lot of changes, maybe one or two sort of, because he was very much against Zionism, Stalin. So maybe one or two were sent to the gulags or were eliminated or whatever. But in fact, it was a good time for the Jewish people between 39 and 41.
You also ended up having quite a lot of people come to your town from the German
in
side, didn't you?
41, that's when it was a very difficult time, because there was a big influx of Jewish people from Poland, because when the Germans came in to Poland in September 39, correct me if I'm wrong, they really were very, very worried, and they had a very good reason to be worried. And they started to come to the east because they thought that they will be safe in Eastern Europe and in the Ukraine, because we were under the Russian government, and they had this piece of paper that they wouldn't sort of go to war against each other. So the people thought that if they come to Ludmir, they will be safe because they were under Russia. And in actual fact, there were so many people that the population practically doubled. And obviously it was very difficult, new immigrants come in and so on, and they didn't have the infrastructure and they didn't have where to house them. But in actual fact, at the end of the day, what we say, from bitter came out sweet, that a lot of these people survived the war because they finished up in Russia. Although in Siberia, obviously in the labor camps, it wasn't, they didn't lick any honey, it wasn't a fantastic time for them, but at least it wasn't sort of a systematic killing, so to speak.
It wasn't a direct form of extermination.
A lot of the Jewish people that survived were the ones from Russia.
Yeah, it wasn't
they were
a
lucky.
form of...
But we stayed on like idiots.
Sorry, it's very interesting because you basically give the argument that I always give, that it wasn't direct extermination in the gulags. It was a form of extermination, but it was a very slow form.
Because they worked them to death.
They worked them to death, but still,
and the weather.
It wasn't like, let's shove them all into a gas chamber like they were doing under the Germans.
Yeah.
So,
well, there weren't any crematoriums, I don't think.
No. But let's move on a little bit to the invasion of the Germans. So our listeners know Soviet Union is invaded by Germany in June 1941. What changes for you?
Under the Germans?
Yes.
Well, they came in 1941, in June 22nd of when they declared Barbarossa, basically, they came in, and the town was blitzed by Goering's planes, but it was still sort of existed, nobody visualized what was going to happen. I mean, in your wildest dream, nobody could have dreamt up anything like that. So they came in, and things became difficult, obviously, as you can imagine. And then in 1942, we were forced to get into the ghetto. And we had to leave our home. We had to leave everything behind. And we had no contacts with people because we had to give up radios and telephones and so on, because obviously they didn't want that people would be connected and to know what is happening and so on. And we went into the ghetto, to a very small house. Yeah. And then in the middle of, that was in 42, in early 42, yeah. And then they had the Wannsee conference and in the Wannsee conference, then they decided about the Heydrich and Himmler. And then so obviously everything was working according to plan. It was according to Germanic precision. And they came in, and we were in the ghetto, and 25,000 Jews in the first pogrom.
Can we stick to the subject of this, because you eventually moved to a small ghetto, But before you moved to the
No,
small
the big ghetto. No,
yes. So with this big ghetto, what do you remember of life in this big ghetto? You said you had...
Whatever I should tell you, I don't really remember because I was very small. So it was really just in my imagination. But obviously things were people were scared. They didn't know what was going to happen. Yeah. The insecurity, suddenly you lost everything. You lost your livelihood, you lost your home,
you started to talk about the pogrom, because this pogrom is really important in your family history, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can you tell us what happened in this pogrom and why did it affect your family so deeply?
What happened in the pogrom? Because we were, the whole family, we were in the sort of sitting and eating lunch in the middle, and the Germans came in with Poles and Ukrainian into the ghetto and starting to round up people. And some people had shelters. We didn't have a shelter because my dad didn't believe that it can happen. And because he spoke German very well and he had German friends and so on, he just didn't visualize that such a catastrophe. And he said it was just a passing time and things would sort out and we'd go back to our normal sort of life. And we didn't have a shelter. And the other thing, my father also had a Fachausweis. A Fachausweis is a work permit, because people that were qualified, they would give them a work permit. So he thought that was a permit for life, to live. So we didn't have anywhere where to go. And but my mother was a quick thinker. So what happened, because the house that the ghetto house was standing on stilts. And we thought, so my mother grabbed quickly a loaf of bread, some honey and some water. And there was a trap door to go down beneath the floorboards. So we went down there and we were lying there. And I would say it was probably about a foot, maybe a little bit more, the height between the ground and the floor. And we were lying there. And while we were lying there, we could see the Germans walking all around, the Ukrainians and the Poles, they were rounding up people. And we could see, because the place, between the stilts, there were sort of pieces of corrugated iron that was, but we could see through the gaps the hems of the German officers. We could see the boots and the bottom of the hems and so on. And they were walking around with the shepherd's dog, German shepherds, to find out, to sniff out Jewish people. And honestly, I just can't believe it. The dogs didn't sniff us out. We were right there. But that was a mad time where I think animals had more compassion for mankind than people themselves. And we were lying there for 3 days. On the third day, because we ran out of food and water, we didn't have anything. So there was a bit of a lull of the shooting. It was a little bit quiet. So my dad decided to go up and to look for something to bring back for us to eat and some water from the house. And he went up and then he came back and he threw in a loaf of bread and some honey. And there was a sort of a trap door, so he kept the trap door open and he was talking to my mother and she asked him what's happening. And suddenly the trap door was shut. But just before he shut it, he told my mother, "Save the children." These were his last words. And that was the last we saw of our dad. And we were lying there for 15 days. And my paternal grandmother was with us. as well. So my paternal grandmother lost a son, my mother widowed with a second, and we 3 children lost our father. And we were lying there for 15 days, but obviously we needed some food, we needed something. So during the night, my mother would crawl out when it was a little bit quiet late at night, because she knew some of the fields, and some of the fields actually belonged to her, because, you know, my mother dealt in wheat and other things. And then she would bring back a beet or an onion or potato, or potato, and sometimes tomato. And obviously at night she couldn't see if the tomatoes were ripe, and she would bring some green tomatoes. That's up to this very day, I prefer green tomatoes. I never knew that tomatoes were supposed to be red. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
amazing the things that children remember.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah.
So when I read your book, I remembered the last words of your dad, "Save the children." It becomes really important later in your story, doesn't it?
Mm.
There's literally his last words. But
He is my hero. My dad is my hero, because he could have lived because he heard from the distance that somebody was coming. But he could have sort of lowered himself, but he thought just in case that somebody has seen him. So he put his own, and then he just was taken away. Yeah, he's a hero. He died so we would live.
Your mum becomes very strong because of this, and I think I found one of my new heroines after reading what your mum does. She's an incredible woman. She's so ballsy and so strong that, yeah.
Well, you have to, you have 3 children. I mean, this is a mother. Yeah,
She took it to heart
I
what
would
he
do the
said.
same for my children, I suppose. I hope it would never come to it, but I would. I suppose so would you, because then when things take over, yeah. But probably she was stronger than most people, yeah, because she lived and the others didn't. So there must have been something stronger in her. Why only 9 children survived?
So your father gets killed, obviously, in the first pogrom, and then you end up in a smaller ghetto.
Yeah, the second ghetto, that was after 15,000 were killed in the first pogrom. And because my dad died and we didn't have any protection anymore, because he went down with a blue work permit, so we couldn't go to the ghetto of the living. We went to the ghetto of the dead. And the people that lived in the living ghetto, they were useful because they could go to work for them, the Germans. And there were very, very few children left. I think we probably were, because they saw children, the Germans, as probably the new generation will grow up and maybe they'll be a bit stronger than the other lot. Yeah.
And then something really...
She didn't have a work permit, yeah.
So before we started recording, we started talking a little bit, and you mentioned the people that had saved you. And in your story, there is a very unlikely person that saved you, and that was a high-ranking officer of the Wehrmacht. Can you tell us a little bit about him and what happened there?
Yeah, in actual fact, my mother was twice saved by Wehrmacht. First, she was caught out of the ghetto by a Polish policeman. One of a young boy, Polish or Ukrainian, dependent, recognized my brother because my mother was out of the ghetto with my big brother at Chaim, and they were walking because she was taking Chaim to Stasha. We call her Stacha, you would call her Stasha, to Stasha, who was my mother's dressmaker. And a boy recognized my brother, and he ran into Polish policemen and said, look, there's a Jewish woman with her son walking here, and they shouldn't walk outside the ghetto. So that Polish policeman came out, and he started to shout to my mother to come back. And mother didn't, she increased her walking pace. And then he said, look, if you're not coming, and he started to whistle, and he said, if you're not coming back, I'm going to shoot. You might just as well come back. So she told Chaim to run to Stacha. She was Polish, Stacha. And she went back, and he took her into Orchard, and he was just loading his gun, and he was going to shoot her. And an old German officer happened to pass, and he saw what was happening, and saw the scenario, and he said, what are you doing? So I said, well, she's Jewish, she's not supposed to be in town. So he said to him, you know what, you should leave the shooting to the Germans. And then he hit her quite badly with his gun over her head, and she suffered from headaches for quite a while. And so she was saved. The Wehrmacht were quite a different lot to the Waffen-SS, or the ones that were carrying out the shooting, and they were a bit different because they were ordinary soldiers. They didn't want to be really in the war. They didn't want to go to turn to mincemeat in Stalingrad or Kursk or anywhere. They didn't want to, obviously. And they just came out from the First World War, what happened to them in the First World War. So they knew what was waiting for them. And the second, that was in the second pogrom where we were standing to be shot in the Wehrmacht. My uncle, he was the only one, I think, that survived at the time, the second pogrom in the prison yard. And he worked in some factory, and he got quite pally with the officer, the Wehrmacht officer that was in charge. His family were killed already. And he told them, my wife and children, he pretended, are going to be taken to Putidin to be shot. So he came in the last minute, practically, and he took us out. But it was very lucky because the Gebietkommissar, the Kommissar Westerheide, was in charge of our ghetto. Either he went for lunch or he disappeared or somewhere, because he was SS, and the SS had the power over the Wehrmacht, as you know. So if he would have been there at that particular moment, I wouldn't be talking to you now, and I wouldn't be having a glass of water.
It's Eric Koch that was in the area with his sadistic girlfriend.
He was the most horrible, because he was the Gebiet all over, the whole. And he was saying, if ever happened that a Ukrainian would sit at a table and having dinner at the same table as he was sitting and having, he will have him shot. Quite a price to pay for a plate of sausage and sauerkraut. He was dreadful. He saw me. He came to the ghetto. In actual fact, he saw me.
Ah, yes. I remember in your book, you were standing on a bookshelf. Was it a bookshelf or a cupboard?
I was hidden. Yeah, because we knew when Koch came, my brothers weren't there because my mother took them out to Stacha during the night. Because when Koch came, we knew things are not going to be happy. But Stacha wouldn't have me. She would have the boys, but because she said I was too small, and I might cry, and it's going to be dangerous for the boys and dangerous for her as well. So she wouldn't have it, which is understandable, obviously. And my mother there was a cupboard, and they hid me on top of the cupboard. But what they didn't realize, and we had a little sort of window, but what we didn't realize, that Westerheide, Anna Alvater, and Eric Koch, they came on riding on horseback. So they were quite high up. So when they were so high up, they could see me. And he asked Westerheide, what is she doing there? But by the time, Westerheide said, well, we sorted out. But by the time Westerheide came back, my mother took me out. she smuggled me out of the ghetto through the barbed wire.
And oh gosh, there was another incident that has blown my mind. That was because you mentioned that you were so small you could have cried. There was another incident where this happened quite a lot in some of the stories where you hear about people having to hide and their children crying and they ended
Yeah,
up being smothered
yeah,
and killed. And that almost happened to you, didn't it?
yeah, it did happen. Yeah. Obviously, mothers would have the children feeding the children, and they would put a cushion to sort of to dampen the cry, so you wouldn't hear them crying. But at times, it wasn't quite so. They use the cushion in different, yeah.
But you don't end up staying in the ghetto. You escape. How do you manage, the four of you, to escape the ghetto? How does it happen?
I wish I could, that, the great escape. I wish I
Literally.
knew. I would have loved to have been older to know how we escaped. I think this is one of the pictures that I would have loved to remember. It would have been quite fun in the snow because it was December and very cold, the Ukrainian winters. Yeah, that would have been quite courageous. Yeah, there
It's as
was
a
a woman with
child,
3 children.
you were a child, so you had a completely different perspective of escaping the snow and the situation than, for example, your mother, where she knew what the dangers were. But to you, you were so small, it could have almost been a game.
Yeah, I suppose it was. Yeah, no, quite. I don't think I laughed. Yeah.
One of my favorite people on this earth, she escaped the Warsaw Ghetto with her family. And she remembers this one moment where they were on a boat sailing up the River Wisła to get away from
The
Warsaw.
book.
Uh, uh, yeah, I can't remember what she was on a river basically trying to get away. And she said to me, because this is what's triggered it, you said about laughing. Her and her sister began to play on the boat and began to laugh. And her mother got so angry with her for smiling and laughing and playing. And it was like, no, this is a serious time. Stop smiling. There was no smiling, there was no laughing, there was no playing, end of. And that's what that kind of triggered that memory of when she told me that. It's a very potent memory she had, actually.
Yeah. My mother used quite a bit of, she had quite a sort of a lot of irony in her jokes. Not jokes, humor, should I say. It's different between a joke and humor.
So you end up escaping, you get out of the ghetto, and you end up staying with the Yamichuks, don't you?
Yeah.
So what was life like there? Where were you staying? Where did you live? And how did you do there?
When we came to the Yakimchuks, we were meant to be in the house. And we were supposed to be most of the time up in the rafters. But the third day, I think, we were sitting and having some food that Mrs. Yakimchuk gave us. We were sitting on the floor and eating, and suddenly there was a knock on the door. And Mrs. Yakimchuk made a sign to her husband to go and open the door. And he made a sign to his son, Ivan, to usher us into the barn to see who came. And we were sitting in the barn waiting who came. And a few hours later, Mr. Yakimchuk came and he said, "I'm very sorry, but you have to leave. I can't keep you because my home has been commandeered by the Germans." And they, in actual fact, they created sort of a hub for training Ukrainian people to work with the Germans against the Russians. Yeah. And there we couldn't go back to the house, so Mrs. Yakimchuk suggested that they dig out a pit in the barn And that became our abode for the next 9 months.
How big was this pit that literally
It wasn't
for
huge. It wasn't a manor. it was how big was it? Honestly, it'd probably be about 2.5 meters by 1.5 meters, thereabout. And it was quite shallow. I could stand up, but my mother couldn't. She constantly was on her knees. And my bigger brother probably couldn't stand there. No, I was the one who stood up. Yeah.
your mum, she used to stretch her legs by sitting on the edge of the pit, didn't she?
Sorry?
Your mum would stretch her legs when she'd sit on the side of the pit.
That was already towards when it got to be later. That was sort of April time or thereabout, and things were getting a bit warmer. And she would sit at the edge of because life for her was terrible. I mean, looking after to try and keep 3 children in check. And yeah, it was very difficult. But her own time was when she would sit at the edge of the pit, and her legs were sort of ready to jump in case if she heard somebody coming, and listening to the frogs squawking. That's the music that she heard. Yeah, that was her pastime.
How did she end up entertaining, because you were all different ages, how did she end up entertaining all of you in literally a 2-meter pit?
Children at war, you can't sort of compare. They grow up very fast. They think differently. It can come out in a child the best and the worst. Yeah.
And I really like the way you talk about your family in this. It's very interesting, especially when you talk about your brother, how it was you got on with your older brother, but your younger brother was...
The middle brother.
Yeah.
No, my older brother, Chaim, he is the kindest, the best person you could wish to meet, and the least selfish. And my middle brother, I think it's a middle child syndrome, and it came out even then. Yeah.
Tell us about him. Why did he have middle child syndrome? Why didn't you
my
like him
middle
as much?
brother, obviously, he was older. But by that time, I was 5 with the Yakim Shooks. I came out, I was nearly 6. So, and my bigger brother was 12, but he had the head of somebody 20s. You know, he was thinking, you know, and he was very, very supportive, very, very supportive. My middle brother, very, very clever, too clever. I mean, intellectually, he was very, very clever. And my mother had to be very careful with him because we thought that he was losing his mind. Because I think I write about it, actually, yeah.
You actually end up back in the house at some point as well, don't you? Why?
Yeah, because in the barn, because Mr. Yakimchuk had to give up the cowshed, he gave it to the Germans. And so he had to take out his horse that was in the cowshed and to bring it into the barn. And he was tied up with a very flimsy rope. And one day he decided to escape because he was prisoner number 5, in fact. We were 4 prisoners. And he wanted to escape. And he managed to break the rope, and he jumped on our pit. And the pit was demolished. And our poor home was demolished. And we were covered in, we were quite badly hurt. And a horse jumps on you. Yeah. And then during the night, we had to there was no other way. We went we were lucky because at that time already, the Germans were preparing for the fight on Kovel. Kovel was a very important strategic point between the East and the West, you see. And they were sort of preparing all the armament and so on. And maybe it happened a day when they weren't there, and we at night we escaped into the house. But while we escaped, a young boy, Simon, the boy, he was about 8 or 9, I don't know exactly, he saw us, and that was so dangerous. And we spent some time, a few days in the rafters again, and then Ivan, the son, rebuilt the pit, and we went back to our, below ourselves, back into the pit.
But before you end up back in the pit, something happens that kind of sours the relationship a little bit.
Yes. Because what happened? No, I'm laughing because when we were in the rafter, there was a lot of hay there. Because Mr. Yakimchuk was a farmer and so on, and he was he wrapped up some apples and pears in whatever, and he hid them in the hay itself to ripen for the summer, you see, because that wasn't the winter. And my brothers discovered the apples and the pears, and they did help themselves, I must say. And my mother kept saying, you mustn't touch them, because we will be out. If Mr. Yakimchuk will find out that you're helping yourself to his apples and pears, we will be out. But anyway, 1 or 2 apples and so on. But the point is, because Mr. Yakimchuk's house wasn't very robust, and obviously the ceiling was sort of jerry-built, and it was timber. And you just had to make one, just to walk on it or move or whatever, it would make a noise. And I think it was a Sunday, and the Yakimchuk had some family that came to see them. And they kept on saying, what's happening up there? And Mr. Yakimchuk said, what do you mean? And he kept on. He bought out barrels of his samagon. It is sort of like vodka, but far more potent. And he kept filling their glasses, and he went, oh, Nasarovia. Yeah. And they wanted to climb up and to have a look. They said, there's something dangerous going up there. And they wanted to go up. And somehow he made them so drunk. And the other thing is there were some children there. So the Yakimchuks normally liked a very quiet time because their daughter was very ill, Pascha was very ill. And they made them sing and scream and jump just for them to forget what's happening up there. And eventually, late at night, they left drunk. And I mean drunk, because Mr. Yakimchuk was very, very generous with his samagon. And then Mrs. Yakimchuk came up to and she said, look, guys, what the hell have you been doing here? And we didn't do anything, if you just move, you could hear. And said, these people kept on asking, who is there? What's happening? They grabbed the ladder, they wanted to go up, because they were worried about Yakimchuk. Somebody came in to the rafters. Anyway, Mr. Yakimchuk got rid of an awful lot of his brew. I called it Chateau Le Pit. Chateau Le Pit, Chateau Le Pit.
I love it.
And yes, that soured our relationship quite badly. And they followed, and it wasn't enough. But as we went up into the rafter, Simon, Mr. Yakimchuk's nephew, that saw us, he went to Yakimchuk and said, that was his uncle, uncle, you're keeping Jews. And he said, who told you? He says, I've seen them with my own eyes. So Mr. Yakimchuk really laid into him, and he said, you mustn't tell anybody. And the most important thing is, don't tell your mother, because your mother is the biggest gossip in the whole village. So the boy kept his the secret. They took him to the priest, and they made him swear in front of the priest that he would never tell anybody, and he never did. In actual fact, when I went back, Simon was still alive, and we went to see Simon. In actual fact, he's in the book. There's a picture of him. Yeah,
I love it. We'll come back to you coming back to Ukraine at the end.
Yeah.
But before we get
and then that would start the relationship. But then they had to get over the anger. And the following day, that was funny. All these revelers, they came back the following day, and they still asked Mr. Yakimchuk, what was that noise? So I said, what do you mean that noise? You drank all my brew, and you're complaining? The noise was in your head, not...
It's smart. It's a smart way to do it.
Yeah.
But your mum, I'm going to come back to her, because she, like I said, I think she was amazing for what she managed to do. But she also, at this time, especially over the winter, she gets really ill, doesn't she?
She was, because there was a time that when the Germans were all around us, because we could hear the Germans, they were in the cow shed and we were in the barn, and all there was a wall that made sort of with planks that fitted not very well, and then we could hear exactly, and we could sometimes, my brothers even looked through, because they were very inquisitive, so they looked through, they saw the German, so preparing the ammunition. And then we saw them swearing and singing and so on. And that was a difficult time for the Yakimchuks to come, because the Germans were all over. We didn't have any water, so my mother called out, and she bought some ice, and then she ate the ice. We too, the children, nothing happened to her, but Mum was very ill. Yeah, very ill. And in actual fact, it left her with a bad chest for the rest of her life. It was a real asthma sufferer.
When your mum sees the doctor post-war,
Dr. Levine.
Yeah, the doctor said if they'd have treated it straight away, I remember this right, if they treated your mother straight away, then she would have been
Not my
cured.
mother. It wasn't my mother. It was Paraska.
Okay.
Because my mother promised them that once we will be liberated, she'll make sure that Paraska would have the best doctor. Because we didn't know yet that Dr. Levitt, or any doctor, but luckily Dr. Levitt survived, and he looked after Paraska. So she lived for a few more years, but then eventually she died. And my mother paid for her antibiotics and the medication, doctors and everything. I think we could never repay the Yakimchuks. Let's not kid ourselves. We could never repay them, that's for sure, because they put their head on the block for us. Yeah. So Paraska got better, but she went too far. Yeah. And yeah.
Well, let's talk about liberation, because you get liberated a lot sooner actually than most of Europe.
The luck, if you can call it luck. We were liberated very early. We were liberated in 22nd of July 44. And when the war was still going on till 45, and then the Polish people from the camps there, they were still incarcerated. Yeah.
So what do you remember of the Soviet liberation?
I don't remember an awful lot, but I remember the walk back, because Mr. Yakimchuk didn't want to take us back. We had actually to walk back, I don't know how many kilometers, probably about 10 kilometers or 50 kilometers, because he didn't want to be seen that in front of the villagers that they kept Jews, which is understandable because of it endangered the whole village, not only the Yakim Chuk, because if we would have been found, the whole village would have been in blaze.
So you finally get home.
Yeah.
What happens when you get home? Because obviously you have war, you've lost 90...
Bleak, very, very bleak.
I was going
Our
to say
home was
98%.
destroyed. There was no home. There was nothing.
Tell us about it, because
Just,
you can't go back to your home.
Yeah, just ground zero, basically.
And not just that, you can't go to your home. Where do you go? Because your home is occupied. Your mum literally...
No, our home was destroyed, but my grandfather's home was his townhouse was still there, and some other people moved in, and obviously we couldn't have it.
How long did you end up staying?
Found a little hovel, then we just... And Stasha came. You know, Stasha was in Poland because she didn't want to be under the Russian occupation. She went back to Poland, but when she got to know that we arrived, she came to see us. She was the first one to come, and she bought 200 rubles and a comb, a special comb to comb out knits.
How long did you end up staying in Ludmir?
I would say best part of 2 years. Yeah.
And why did you end up leaving?
Because my mother wanted to go to the West, and she didn't want the children to be... she wanted to go back to some kind of normality, and she didn't want to live anymore in Ludmil, for obvious reasons.
So tell us, where did you go?
And funnily enough, there were 30 people that survived. We all left. Everybody left. Yeah.
Where did you end up going?
Well, we went to my mother always called it Lemberg, to Lvov, or Lviv, what they call now. And then we went to Poland, to Bytom. And what happened in Poland was very, very difficult. My mother didn't want it anymore. So we left, and we went to Czechoslovakia. And from Czechoslovakia, we went to Austria, to Salzburg, and we were in a DP camp for about 8 or 9 months, and the conditions were terrible. And obviously the Austrians, they didn't look favorably on the Jews, because they blamed the Jews for Hitler losing the war. You know that. Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? And then afterwards, we crossed the Alps to Italy illegally, a whole group of us. And we were in Italy for, again, the best part of 2 years, until 1948, when Israel became independent. We went to Israel. Yeah. In 20th of November, 1948. Yeah.
Your story is incredible, and I think people should go out and read it, because usually the story of a Holocaust survivor is a death camp or a concentration camp.
Yeah.
There's not so many stories of surviving literally in a 2-meter pit for months on end. I mean, that still is mind-blowing, and I complain about...
I don't know if I was successful, to tell you the truth, to make it a universal story rather than just a Holocaust story. I hope I was. I don't know.
I think you were, because you talk about so many different experiences. Because again, the Jews in Poland experienced it different when you were under complete German rule for so long, and occupation, to, for example, moving between German and Soviet. And then I like the story. It's very interesting. I think people should be able to read it, because it shows
you asked me a lot of questions. May I ask you something?
Of course, you can ask me anything you like.
Right. You must have read a lot of different. Do you read? You must have read Anna Frank.
Yes.
You must have read Prima Levi.
Of that number, yes.
That was fantastic. He was very, very intelligent. God forbid, not for 1 single minute do I compare, but no, definitely not. To that, it's fantastic writer. But how did you find A Mother's Courage in comparison to other Holocaust stories? Was it different, or was it another Holocaust story?
I don't think it's just another Holocaust story. Your story can't get
You
lost.
don't have to be polite. You can.
No. I'm being honest. It's one of those stories that won't. Okay, let me rephrase this differently. When you think of the Holocaust, you think of death camps and concentration camps and incredible suffering and torture and death and murder, and that's what you think of. I'm not saying your story was easy, because it wasn't. It was very difficult in a different way, where it shows how you have to survive under difficult conditions. And the courage of your mother just shines through. Like I said before, I love
And does
your
it come
mother.
through? That's
Yes.
sort of more of a sort of a universal story rather than just a Holocaust story. I was trying, but it's very difficult to get away from the horror.
But it is, look, it is a Holocaust story, but it's not a Holocaust story. Does that make sense?
That's a compliment. Thank you.
And it's, for me, I think you describing the loss of your father, you can actually feel the loss of your father in your words. You feel certain emotions that you've written in the book when reading the words. You feel pain, sadness, there's hatred, of course, which is understandable.
Did any of your friends read it?
Not yet, because I read it first, but I'm going to grab myself a copy, which everybody else should, because we're going to put it in our bookshop.
Because when I wrote it, in actual fact, I never thought it's going to be published. I wrote it just through COVID, like a lot of, But then we sent it to a literary agency, and they read it, and they said, we would love to do it. We would like your book. And then we had 3 companies, like Pan Macmillan, Welbeck, and Hachette, which Hachette is a huge international company, French company, but they're bigger than Pan Macmillan. And we had 3 offers. And I went with Pan Macmillan. And then came another offer from a Russian publishing house. And I said, no, thank you very much for the offer, but come back once the war is over.
Oh, I like that.
Come back, but when the war's, we will speak. And then I had the offer from a Ukrainian publishing house.
Malka, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you with me here on this podcast, and we'll make sure to get your book in our bookshop for people to be able to get a hold of. I admire your courage.
Your charm, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing you.
You too. I loved it, and I think you and I have very similar opinions, and I love it, and I love meeting people who have the same kind of pattern of thinking. So
anyway, we're honored to know you.
Honor is mine, by the way. Honor is mine.
Mutual.
Thank you so much, ladies.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.